percentage of the people here, well, let people, we have a few more people coming in.
This camera's cool. Let's follow his face.
Because so many of you might have already heard my other talk, I'm going to briefly recap the events that led up to me being here. In 1975, I was working in the woods with a crew of us, 6 other men, and long, hard day, physical labor. Day was over. We worked right up till dark and loaded up our equipment and we're headed out of there. And we saw this object hovering near the road as we were driving home. And it was unmistakable. It was just as clear as a bell. And I was in the believing that this thing would be gone before it had taken more than a few steps. But the closer I got to it, the more I was aware that it wasn't going anywhere. So I slowed down and, of course, immediately my getting out of the truck and heading toward this thing was pretty alarming to the rest of the group. And they were yelling at me to get back in the truck. And it was, the closer I got, the more intense their fear, mine too. But when I got up close, the apprehension about what I was doing was pretty much at its peak, but it was just such an awesome sight to see this smooth as glass metallic object glowing there. And but when it suddenly got louder and started to move, I just jumped for cover. The frenzy of the crew urging me to get back in the truck, swearing at me and telling me to come back to the truck so we could get the heck out of there. Heightened my apprehension to the point where, so when I saw that movement and heard the increase in volume, I just jumped for cover. I was in a crouch, and it was when I stood up to run back to the truck that the blast of energy come out of that craft and hit me. And the crew was immediately certain that it had killed me, They said that they were yelling, "He's dead," because it was that violent, throwing me through the air, 15, 20 feet. And, John said, my back and meat, just no bone, not a bone in my body. And when they recovered their courage, of which they had considerable, because to come back at all, I think did show a great deal of bravery. They said that, because they saw the craft leave, that their greatest fear was what my body was going to look like. So at the time, I was accepting the term abduction, but after having, decades to think about the whole circumstances of everything, I eventually came to the conclusion that it wasn't even an intentional weapon that was fired there, that it just because I stood up, closed the distance between me and the craft, and this energy, just discharged from it. I mean, you've probably all been in a situation where you, on a dry day, you can rub your feet across the floor and come up to the water pipe or something, see a spark jump. And I think it was something of that nature, you close enough and the spark will jump. Our big UFO skeptic at the time issued a paper dismissing pilot reports of UFOs by saying that it was because of this effect. When an airplane travels through the air at high speed, that it builds up charges in the surface of that aircraft in millions of volts. And that's true, and that's, you know, when I was a student pilot, we would attach a ground wire to the plane before you brought the fuel nozzle close to avoid igniting gasoline fumes. But it was a pretty lame explanation for what the pilots were describing. It was not a spark flying around, it was a UFO, but nevertheless, it does document that these kinds of things could happen. You could imagine a UFO flying through the atmosphere at very high speeds might build up a huge charge on the surface, or it could have been, you know, just a sort of a side effect of the propulsion unit. But whatever happened there, I believe that I was injured, and at that point, it was necessary to take me aboard just to revive me. That had the aliens left it to the crew to take me to the hospital, that would have taken an hour. And if my injury was as simple as cardiac arrest, it would have been way too late. None of those guys knew CPR. So if they had stuck around and grabbed me and taken me for medical treatment, that probably would have been the worst possible scenario. But I do give those guys a huge amount of credit for the courage it took to come back to try to rescue me that night, and for what they went through, being accused of murdering me and making up this insane cover story. And, you know, it's kind of funny they would ever come up with that kind of a theory, because if they had murdered me and buried my body out there, you would think the simplest explanation was he just went over the hill and we didn't see what happened and he never came back, you know, maybe a bear or a mountain lion got him, that kind of a thing. You could picture other scenarios, you know, a tree, limb falling, hitting you in the head. At the time that the crew passed the lie detector test, the president of the American Polygraph Association said, granted, one test is not 100% foolproof, but when you have 6 people passing tests on the same issue, the odds are 1,000,000 to 1 of there being any kind of an error in the testing. That was with 6 tests, but now there's been 16 past tests. So it's certainly more than 1,000,000 to 1. I passed 5 tests from 3 different examiners, top-notch examiners. You know, people, former police officers with years of experience is as good as it gets. And the results and any criticisms of the tests have all been reviewed by the top researchers in the field. You know, basically the founders of the science of polygraphy, Dr. Raskin, University of Utah, Baxter, the top men. And recently, a quotation from the current president of the American Polygraph Association. But what I wanted to focus on today here, and I'm going to take questions about anything you want when we get done here, but I wanted to focus a little bit on this incredible reaction that we got. At the time that the crew passed the polygraph test, there was still this onslaught of attempts to explain it away, one after another after another. And Dr. Harder made the point that testimony from 6 witnesses would have been sufficient to convict a person of murder in an American court of law. And yet, here people were humming and hawing and saying, no way, no way. You know, when on top of 6 witnesses, they all passed polygraph tests, some of them more than once. And I made the comment that, you know, either we're setting the bar way too high for UFO things, or it's way too low for giving the death penalty. So you got to think about that, you know, that what would have been considered conclusive proof was denied. And that was just theory after theory after theory. I could name a whole bunch of them just on the idea that the whole thing was a delusion on my part. That it was a drug hallucination, that I had a transitory psychosis. This Dr. Persinger had this idea that the fault line right through there there was some kind of plate tectonics that generated some kind of massive electrical discharge that passed through my brain and created this delusion that the hypnotist had planted these ideas in my head. Transitory psychosis, even though I had a whole battery of psychiatric tests done at the time, a perfectly normal pattern of scores. The hypnosis was witnessed by 3 psychiatrists and a whole slew of other observers. Everything was done properly. There were no leading questions. There was no seismic activity recorded at that location. I had blood and urine samples put through the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's drug screen, which proved there were no drugs of any kind in my body. On and on. But all of these things about delusion is, wait a minute. Travis isn't the only one who saw this. There were 7 people who saw this. Nobody has identical hallucinations. It just doesn't happen. If it was some kind of erratic stimulation of the brain, the hallucinations would be just as erratic, and everybody would see a different, absolutely identical. They use different words to describe the same thing. In the police report, one of the men described the beam, the energy, as looking like a long blue flame. But whether it looked like a lightning bolt or a laser beam or whatever, it was a blast of energy so powerful. I mean, it was compared to stepping on a landmine, a grenade exploding, whatever. It was extremely violent enough to lead the crew to, mention that I might be dead when they talked to the law enforcement people. And it didn't stop there. Attempts to explain it away went on and on. This professional debunker, which it later turned out was actually sort of a CIA disinformation specialist. It was interesting to me that explanations like the delusion, the logging contract was supposedly, this was all a story made up to get out of the logging contract. Never mind the fact that the UFO incident was never brought up at the default proceedings, never offered as an explanation, and couldn't have possibly benefited the crew boss in any way anyway. The default proceedings were just exactly as they would have been with or without the incident. There was no benefit whatsoever in that regard. But theory after theory after theory, with absolute proof to the contrary, local folks, people in the media would grab onto it. The idea that just don't give me any excuse not to believe this, and the flimsiest thing, people were willing to latch onto it. I come up with a saying that I put on a t-shirt at my last conference, and it goes something like this. For those who refuse to believe, no amount of evidence is ever enough. For those who have experienced it, no more proof is necessary. And I think that observation in regards to UFOs is probably part of the intent on the part of the aliens. The skeptics say, well, if there was anything to this UFO thing, they would land on the White House lawn and say, here we are, and I'll be out in the open. That's definitely not happening. But I make the point that the other end of the spectrum is they're capable with that kind of technology of doing everything that they're doing here on this planet and remain completely undetected. There would be no ufology, there would be no sightings of any kind. They're not like bumbling fools, This is extremely advanced technology. Michio Kaku was commenting on in a television interview that people keep imagining these alien civilizations as being maybe a few hundred years ahead of us. You know, 100 years ago we didn't have radio, we didn't have airplanes, we certainly didn't have cell phones. Almost all of the technology we have is only 100 years old. And so he says you've got to consider that these systems, these star systems, are literally millions of years ahead of us. And I'm talking about star systems in our galaxy. This is the local, distance-wise, stellar neighborhood. A lot of people don't realize that when you go outside and you look at the sky at night, most of those points of light are not stars. They're entire galaxies, like our galaxy, which is the Milky Way. You see the Milky Way spread out there. That's the galaxy we're in. And from a huge distance, our Milky Way looks like a point of light, like a single star. So just our galaxy has literally billions of stars. And last year, NASA came out and made the statement that because of the Hubble telescope observations, it's now known for certain that virtually every star has about a dozen planets. So this Drake equation that was come up with, and Carl Sagan talked about it in that miniseries Cosmos, had certain values plugged into it that were extremely conservative. The numbers, estimating the number of civilizations in this galaxy were much smaller than we can see that they would be with the present knowledge. The skeptics were saying, well, okay, maybe there could be life in this galaxy, but they'd never find us. We'd be like some little point of peat particle of sand on a beach somewhere. You'd never find it. Well, with the primitive technology, the Hubble telescope, we have already located dozens of planets going around other stars, confirming that they're there, and even to the extent of seeing which ones are in what they call the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold, a sufficient distance from their star that they're not going to be cooked or frozen. And so with a civilization millions of years older than us, they've been aware of us for a long time without even coming here. So the idea that they would have to wander the universe and just happen upon us one chance in a billion is really absurd. Our learned men of science have been way too arrogant in presuming that since we can't go there, they can't come here. You know, since we, at that time, we can't see them, they can't see us. So, you know, they would have known about us, and if they wanted this planet for themselves, we'd never know it hit us, and it would have been long ago, hundreds of years ago, you know, back when all we had to throw back was rocks. But even if they came along right now, as Stephen Hawking has said, oh, we better not let them know we're here, they might exterminate us. If they wanted it, we'd never know it hit us. There'd be no dogfights in the sky with fighter jets. Even with our science, we could figure out something that could eliminate every human being on this planet. They've already got things that could do that. We actually have the capacity to exterminate ourselves. And that also brings in it is more additional support for my theory that these aliens are not malevolent. If they wanted to do us harm, it would have already happened. And the other litmus test is kind of what Carl Sagan was saying in Cosmos, that, one of the things that he was saying, that here's the number of civilizations that arise, and here's the percentage of those that make it past their nuclear age and don't self-destruct. So if they were as warlike as we are, and never got any greater moral or ethical development, they would no longer exist. Because with that level of technology, it's far beyond any weapon we have. They would have exterminated themselves. So just, by, what do you call it, natural selection, the aliens would, you understand, have a greater moral and ethical development that would keep pace with the technology, or they would have self-destructed. So, I became interested over the years in why this pushback against something that really, you know, on a scientific, rational basis, what is wrong with the idea of believing that this is not the only ball of dirt out here in space that's got living things on it? And, you know, given the infinity of time involved, of course, there's many planets out there. I mean, it's a given. It's absurd to think otherwise. I mean, this is more ridiculous than the flat earthers, you know, that we're the only life in the universe, or that if there is other life, they never find us, or, you know, this is beyond ridiculous. So the thing I was saying about the idea that if they're not coming down landing on the White House lawn, it's not open contact, but at the same time, they're not completely cloaking. I really do believe that with that level of intelligence, that level of technology, that the sightings that we're having, the contact we're having is not accidental. They're capable of knowing, I mean, if the NSA knows where every cell phone camera is, believe me, they do. Certainly the aliens have better technology than that. And if you did get a picture that they didn't want you to have, they could reach in there and fiddle with the results too. So I really do think that, you know, there's a huge amount of logical thinking that points in the direction that the degree of observations that we're having of alien visitation here is deliberate, it's planned. If you have a sighting, you weren't just luckily seeing them accidentally letting be glimpsed. They're actually deliberately allowing themselves, and in some cases, you know, picking the person who's observing. And that's a pretty huge leap. But it's always of a certain degree. The thing that I was talking about. For the person who experienced it, no more proof is necessary. But always, the converse is there. For a person who wasn't there, that's not sufficient proof. Why? Why? So that this can trickle up through societies, through human, across the globe, in a way that's the least destructive. If something absolutely incontrovertible, undeniable was to happen today, the people in this room would try pretty much, I would think, but the world population at large would be plunged into chaos. Half the population would go to work. There would be instantly rebellion against the idea of paying huge amounts of money for gasoline and electricity and these kinds of things. The technologies that are available would make all of that obsolete. The world economy is based on energy dollar. And many financial, religious, political organizations would be turned upside down. I mean, it would just be destructive. There was a famous anthropologist, Alfred North Whitehead, that made the observation that when the so-called civilized world reached out and explored the world, the more developed cultures, contact with the less developed, was almost always destructive of the less developed tribes, the persons that were affected. It was exploitative, and you know, a lot of bad things were done by the more advanced cultures. But at the same time, some of just the impact of suddenly having all of their traditional ways overturned and all this sort of stuff, that was very destructive, just as a matter of course, without any intention on the part of the explorers. So. Gene Roddenberry was the inventor of Star Trek, and he came up with this thing called the Prime Directive, the Non-Interference Directive. And, you know, yeah, it's science fiction, but it's prescience. I mean, it's, you know, Arthur C. Clarke was a science fiction writer too, and he invented the communication satellite in fiction before it became reality. And he was the one that said, a sufficiently advanced technology would be indistinguishable from magic to us. So the impact of open acknowledgement of our place in the universe right now would undoubtedly be too destructive if it was abrupt. But it's inevitable that we are going to become aware that we are not alone, that there are these greatly advanced cultures, and we're not ready for it. And that's, people say, why am I out here talking about this, you know? I can tell you the rewards are barely survival level. You know, when I backed off from talking about this and I went to work at the paper mill for 11 years, you know, that was the first real wage I had in my life, you know. And I'm doing this out of a feeling of obligation, you know. I tried to run away from it. You know, people congratulate me on having the courage to come forward and all that. Now, I don't deserve any of that kind of praise because I really did try to just, you know, push it aside and not do any interviews. But I found out that if I didn't cooperate with the interview, it didn't make the story, so the TV show or the article. It just made it turn out a lot more negative than it would be if I could get out there and set the story. And so, along with the burden of having had this happen to me, I've had to accept that there's a moral obligation, a responsibility to try to make something good come of it. So, by making people aware that there's a core reality here, I think it's part of the preparation process that the aliens are actually involved in. They're letting us know they're here, that we're not alone in a very measured kind of way. It's never going to be that kind of proof that we'd love to have, the people in this room, but it's coming and it's percolating up. Over time, I've sensed a paradigm shift, so to speak, a sweeping sea change in reaction locally, especially with young people, email contact from around the globe. The perception of this phenomenon is growing, and I think greatly underestimated. That it's not, we're not too far away from a readiness that this is a frank reality. When I talk about, you know, I gave a talk here a while back to some group of people in Hollywood, an audience about this size, but they were all producers, actors, movie makers, you know. And I'm saying, you know, you've got to quit resorting to the easy storyline. Aliens as invading monsters. Aliens as quasi-mystical, magical, supernatural beings. You know, when I relate to people, audiences, and I say, just think of them as those people from way over there that we don't know too much about. And people actually seem kind of disappointed in that. They kind of like that aspect of it. But the truth is, that's the point we need to get to. The sort of a matter-of-fact realization. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be some really amazing science and some really amazing discoveries with open communication with life from other worlds. But we got to be ready for it, and we have to avoid either demonizing or deifying them. You know, Hollywood's tendency to characterize them as invading monsters. You notice that so often they're completely unclothed. It makes them more beast-like. You know, like in Cowboys and Aliens, the aliens looked more like reptilian gorillas. You know, they got a hand, but it's got 3-inch claws on it. Now, come on, a hand like that's going to make microelectronics and stuff like that. I really do think that in my case, in analyzing the circumstances of what happened to me, that there was no negative intention. I try to avoid, you know, casting myself as an expert on everything. I'm just understand that all I'm doing is this is my best guess. I'm not trying to say that I'm an authority on the subject. I had a powerful, deeply affecting experience that changed my life forever, and I've thought deeply about it for 4 decades. And I'm just sharing with you my own philosophy, my own theories, and I'm not somebody who's going to point to this and say you have to believe this because I'm the oracle of truth here. I'm telling you what happened to me happened, and what we do with it is this knowledge is the important thing. So I come up with a workshop here that I first began, and these slides had to do with that. I began the workshop with how many people believe everything you heard at this conference, and nobody raised their hand, and that was refreshing. Because it's not all true, and the difficulty we've had in persuading the general public and the mainstream media that there is a core reality here is some of the ridiculous stuff, The most outlandish thing is what the media tends to focus on when they come to these sorts of events. And there have been a number of esteemed investigators who just got fed up with the whole thing and just washed their hands of it. They talk about, we got to drain the swamp, we got to dignify this sort of thing, we've got to eliminate that point of view. But I don't really think that's, I'm not in favor of any sort of censorship. I think the ridiculous and spurious claims fade away on their own by just raising the bar in terms of what we take to be true. The UFO debunkers and skeptics have thought they were leading the charge. They're going to prevent this irrational stuff from creeping through society, and they're going to protect all decent thinking people from this absurd fantasy. But these are people who have their own psychological issues. People who have a craving for certainty that is not really available. That's what befell Nazi Germany. Somebody comes along with all the answers, and people just are so hungry for that kind of certainty. But we have to become comfortable with a little bit of ambivalence. When we don't know, we have to acknowledge we don't know. In my case, there were certain circumstances that suggest, well, this might explain it, or this might explain it, or this might explain it. But I didn't jump out there and say, well, this is exactly what happened, because I didn't know for sure, And by leaving that open, certain people were so uncomfortable with that, they would come up to me and try to supply all the answers. When I was just giving a talk here in Canada a few days ago, a guy comes up to me and says, are you ready for all the answers? I said, before you start, let me tell you. Ever so often somebody comes up to me and says, here's who they are, here's where they're from, here's what was meant by this when that happened to you, and this, and their intention was this. And I say, but the problem with all these people who come up to me is they're all different. So you're going to have to explain to me why your set of answers I ought to accept over theirs. And so he just kind of faded away and dropped the subject. But he was so, positive. You ready for all the answers? And I am skeptical of people that are so certain and have all the answers. This is unknown, and that's by design, both by the aliens and our government, who knows a bit more than we do. And it's not so far-fetched to think that part of the motivation on the part of the government is not just some nefarious personal conflict of interest. I mean, they don't want to come forward right now and say, okay, here's the truth. We've been lying to you for all these decades, but now from here on, trust us. So that creates a problem for the government. But aside from that, they're perfectly aware of what I believe the aliens are aware of, is that an open acknowledgement of this right now is something that we're not ready for. Granted, there are these interests that are associated with the government because, you know, that's just the way, the name of the game, the nature of the animal. People who rise to places of high power are people who are very tied to the big money interests on this planet. And this kind of knowledge and technology threatens that in a very personal way for them. So, and then there's something that, you know, we share an interest with. This kind of technology, if they weaponize it, could be devastating if the enemy got a hold of it. So, you know, like Stan Friedman was saying, when you share it with your friend, you're sharing it with your enemies too. The reason for secrecy, some of it is in our own best interest. So, on our own, worldwide, with a sort of a movement here, we want the ability to sort of decipher the truth for ourselves. People ask me, point to the valid cases, you know, tell me which cases I can reject. And I won't do that because at the time my incident first hit the news, the top debunkers were already in full attack mode before they even had any of the facts. The top debunker that attacked me wrote parts of several books and sent out a flurry of papers to the media. First was writing about this incident as if 3 men riding in a car experienced this. He was already trying to debunk it when it was 7 men riding in a truck. So without even having the facts, he's already convinced that it didn't happen, or trying to convince others that it didn't happen. Turns out, through the Freedom of Information Act, that he had been sort of recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency to discredit these kinds of things for all the reasons we just discussed. But my workshop concerning how do we know what to believe and what to be more skeptical of. The first of all is to get the facts first. And this quote from Emerson here in my book was a good starting point. Get the facts first. How do we know what's a fact? You know, the person that comes to me and says, there are 17 species missing, you know, or some other pronouncement of here's how it is. My question is, how do you know this? What source can you point me to where I'll be as certain of that as you are? And it's not impossible that some people might have some kind of inside track on such things, but very often, you know, that people come up with these hard and fast pronouncements in the absence of any real basis. Yeah, what constitutes a fact? Everything that we believe really needs to come down to 2 things. Are your facts true, and is your reasoning valid? And you can do this thing called fact-checking. It's things the media doesn't do very often enough. And then what is valid reasoning? You know, this is something that, you know, really ought to be a much bigger part of our educational system. There are certain patterns of thought that are just fallacious on the face of it. And the skeptics and the debunkers are very prone to these kinds of things. They're very fond of saying, there is no evidence. You know, and Stan Friedman in his talks will say, okay, there's all these Air Force studies, these the university studies. He's pointing to the evidence that the skeptics are pretending doesn't exist. They just make a blanket statement. It's not just in UFOs, it's many topics, you know, just in the area of health and supplements and like that. You know, people who are against vitamins and supplements will say there are no studies to back up these claims. There are tons of studies, university studies, good studies that, you know, this vitamin is, you know, associated with this condition and those sorts of things that do exist, but they're very fond of saying there is no proof. But the additional fallacy beyond that is, even if it were true that there were no studies or no evidence, that doesn't disprove anything. The skeptic is equating the absence of proof to be the absolute equivalent of disproof. And that's extremely illogical and illogical. If you compare it to the court system, if someone goes into court and is declared not guilty, that is not the same thing as being declared innocent. In the case of not guilty, there is not sufficient evidence to prove that they did it. So they might be innocent, and maybe they're guilty, but they're just not able to prove it. But the court can say you're innocent. We exonerated him. We found out he was somewhere else. He could not have done it, and that's possible. But so many people equate not guilty as the same thing as innocent, and it's not the same thing. So the skeptic's obsession, their absolute terror of believing something that's untrue, leads them to believe things that are untrue. Because if you believe that something is false when it's really true, then you're believing something that's untrue, right? So they convince themselves and much of the public that there's nothing to UFOs because they don't want it to be, and on the basis of the idea that it's not proved, so therefore it's disproved. You want to investigate a particular case or a phenomenon in general, I compose this line of reasoning. You really have to be totally open to the contrary. You know, is there any other way to explain this? Is there any way that the opposition could be true? And it's sincerely, because if what you want in your heart of hearts is the truth above all, you don't get into this defensive attitude that you're going to defend your position against theirs, because you wind up in kind of a situation where you're basically looking for ways, you're cherry picking. You're only picking the evidence that supports your view. You're only picking the evidence that you can use to refute the other person's point of view. And if you're sincerely, honestly wanting the truth, you just let the facts fall where they may. You look at all of it. You look at all of the things that support your point of view. You look at all of the things that support your opponent's point of view. Or you shouldn't even consider that as an opponent. Because the objective always has to be what is right, not who is right. You know, if you get personal about it and you're having a heated argument, and the reason you're injecting emotion into it is because you're defending yourself and attacking them, or you're feeling attacked, or they're feeling attacked. It should, you know, a debate, a discussion about what to believe shouldn't invoke any sort of emotional content at all. We really should just be, are the facts true? Is the reasoning valid? So our loyalty is to the truth, not a truth, not my truth. We welcome the truth regardless. You know, if somebody can disprove something that I was in error believing, we should be grateful for that rather than feeling defeated. You know, this tribalistic, you know, us against them, this oppositional pattern of discourse that's used in, I mean, we're in election year, right? You see this all the time, you know. I would like to see political debates that are discussing the fundamental underlying principles of what we're supposed to all be for, not just, you know, how much mud can you sling on somebody. And it degenerates to that on both sides, or all sides, I should say. And Voltaire made the observation, it's lamentable to be a good patriot. In other words, a person who becomes an enemy of the rest of the people. And a lot of us, you know, advocating the reality of UFOs come to feel ridiculed or marginalized by mainstream media and some of our own associates. That your loyalty to the truth can kind of sometimes be kind of isolating. It kind of puts you at odds with people who don't think like that. But if we avoid being confrontational, and I always really advocate Stan Friedman's book on this. He's really good with, with demonstrating that, although, we've made all these great strides, science has, made these advances, and without a doubt we've received the benefits, but there's so many instances where they say stuff and say, this is what you have to believe, don't believe that because we say so. I don't know how much of these examples are in Stan Friedman's book, but there's a huge amount of opposition that Louis Pasteur had with the idea that there's these little microscopic things that can make people sick, The inventors of vaccinations, they were heretics. This was extremely dangerous to come up with these things. There was one scientist, a medical doctor named Simowitz, who had the audacity to say that surgeons should wash their hands before going to the next patient because they were infecting these women and killing them with childbed fever. And he was hounded. He was basically fired, ostracized, and wound up dying horribly of it because of this discrimination. How dare you say that the doctor isn't clean just by the fact that he's this learned man? Of course he's clean, right? Well, all kinds of silly things in the day. I'm a great admirer of Aristotle, but he took it as fact that women had fewer teeth than men. Well, there was this thing called observation in science, open a mouth and look in there and you find out that men and women have the same number of teeth, He also believed that ants had 8 legs, and no, they don't. That's a spider thing. But there's a temperature scale, Kelvin, named after Lord Kelvin, great scientist of his day. Made the pronouncement that man will never travel faster than 60 miles an hour because the air would be sucked out of the vehicle and he would suffocate. So the idea that we can rely on experts, that somebody can stand up there and say, this can't be real, is something we can't really rely on. We have to do our own thinking. Wow, what a concept, how daring that is, And on the basis of what? Are the facts true? Is the reasoning valid? There's a whole school of thought. Logic and reasoning is a fine science. And it's all about separating truth from fiction. And we can do this. And by attrition, just by a normal, natural process, survival of the fittest, whatever you want to call it, evolution, the truth will come out. The truth of the reality of visitation of Earth by extraterrestrial spacecraft, the existence on other planets of beings far in advance of us, and they're not all advanced. I mean, there's planets way behind us, but we're not going to worry about them, are we? They're not going to come here, and we'll never know about them until we can go there. It's only the ones who are spacefaring that concern us, and some of them have been doing it for millions of years. I believe that these beings called grays, beings I encountered fit into that category, are actually probably a variety of species. And Charles Darwin did a study in the Galapagos Islands where these finches wound up being distributed across the islands, but because of their isolation and separation, they became very distinctive in their traits. And the same thing with these so-called grays. It's possible that because they've been spacefaring for thousands of years or millions of years, they may have colonized other planets, spread out and differentiated in ways to where that explains a little bit of the variation we get in the description of these beings. They might have common origins, but at the same time, there are biological laws that we can observe here on this planet that explains how creatures can look very, very similar because of living in a similar environment, not because they're related. The American pronghorn has a counterpart in Africa. It's a true antelope. And they're very, very similar, but very fast. I've got personal proof that pronghorn is faster than a cheetah. One day we were driving to work at this very job where this incident happened, and there was some antelope in the road, and instead of running off to the side, they ran up the road, and then the trees got so dense that they couldn't get off the road. I said, Mike, let's see how fast they're going. We got right up behind them, and they got up to 70 miles an hour and kept it up for a quarter of a mile. So that's faster than any cheetah could do. I wondered about that, but I got reading about it, and they said that there was actually a species of cheetah that existed here on the American continent, and that is what shaped the pronghorn before the cheetahs here became extinct. And I point to the example of everything in the sea comes to be very fish-like, even mammals. If it lives in the water, it's going to look like a fish because that's what works there. So the kind of creatures that are going to build machinery and to travel and all that sort of thing are going to look very human-like. See, the skeptics are fond of saying, well, an alien creature wouldn't look remotely like a human being, not even these grays, not 2 arms and 2 legs. It's going to be insect-looking or octopus-looking or something. But I don't agree. I think that the similarity to us is inevitable, and probably we're going to find that life on other worlds is going to be astonishingly similar to what's here, rather than bizarre in ways. I mean, of course, there's going to be we discover some pretty weird stuff in the jungles and whatnot, and in the fossil record here. But in general, the laws of biology, bilateral symmetry, all that sort of thing, form follows function, the environment shapes the creature, there are all going to be, laws and rules that exist elsewhere. Theoretical chemists, biochemists have come up with scenarios of non-carbon-based life, non-water-based life, but those chemistries, if you study them, really fall apart pretty quickly because it's not sustainable into the kind of complexity that we have here with carbon-based water, oxygen breathing, all that sort of thing. And when NASA observes these other planets, they get a spectral signature. The light coming from there can actually give you information about the composition of the source. And they're following that same rule, that what supports life, our best guess is what supports life here. The example that I give is the American flying squirrel as opposed to the sugar glider that lives in Australia. The sugar glider is a marsupial. The marsupials diverged from mammals, most mammals, the regular placental mammals, millions of years ago, I think like 360 million years. And yet the sugar glider and the American flying squirrel are extremely similar because they're nocturnal, they live in trees, and they live in a very similar environment, so they look incredibly alike. And so that there can be aliens who look like us, who can walk among us, is not far-fetched at all. It's actually not an impossibility, but actually a likelihood. And in my personal observation is most likely explanation for the human-looking beings that I encountered in my experience. I initially thought that they were probably representatives of some agents of some Earth-based agency, but further analysis of my experience, leads me farther and farther away from that explanation. Still, just a theory, I'm not certain of these things. I wasn't given solid information or answers in that regard. It's not impossible that some other explanation fits, but I do think that's the most likely thing. So, on this topic, I'd like to kind of open it up to some questions and suggestions, comments. You?
Yes, thank you. Well, I agree that this intelligence is almost likely beneficial and that we will be here right now if they often was the case. With that in mind, you said you gradually became aware of the fact that yours wasn't an intentional abduction and more like a roadside rescue. What led you eventually to that kind of
Okay, there's a whole number of circumstances that led me away from my initial impression of this thing as being a horrible, threatening, life-threatening attack on myself to being actually quite the opposite. In the movie, there's a scene where the actor is held down on the table, 3 aliens standing around him, and there's a membrane over his face, and he's struggling to breathe through it, and struggling to scream through it. And in my experience, there was no membrane. But I think for the purposes of a movie, that was actually a pretty good story device, coincidental or not, to represent to the audience the feeling that suffocation gives you. And a lot of people just don't understand why I lost control to the extent that I did. It was overwhelming. I nearly lost my mind with fear. But at the root of it was that feeling of suffocation. I felt like I couldn't get enough air. But whether that was because the air inside that ship wasn't quite right for humans, or was a side effect of that energy beam hitting me in the head and chest, maybe some of both. But you begin with the feeling of suffocation. It generates panic like nothing else can. The technique, the interrogation technique of waterboarding is extremely effective. The enemy is aware of it. They know it's not going to be fatal. They train for it. They come in there thinking that they can beat it, and it still works. Nothing can reason away the kind of fear and that suffocation brings, and all without any physical harm. Person being interrogated. So there was that factor. There was the factor that I felt mortally wounded inside, something terribly wrong. I felt, I was dying, and all that combined with feeling like I needed to flee, like I needed to fight back, and I could hardly move, felt so weakened. That added to the panic. I'm not able to, protect myself or escape. Being in this dimly lit, claustrophobic little space with suddenly seeing these creatures face to face, suddenly realizing that I'm trapped. All of these things combined to generate a level of fear that was just over the top. So that led all of these perceptions to be much more negative than they would have been. Now, when they came around the table, and there was sort of a standoff there, and I'm backing up away from them, and they're staring into me. I described from the beginning how that stare, those eyes looking into me, was the core of my nightmares for so long. It was definitely very frightening to see an alien creature with an intelligence behind it, an unknown level of intent. At the same time, lacking in human emotional warmth or any connection that way. We all tend to react to people who seem totally unfeeling towards us, as we interpret that as hostile. Generally, just good manners make people smile and be friendly, to reassure that you're not hostile. So a person who seems totally indifferent to you seems hostile. So that's a factor. But when they came around the table and they were staring into me, they gave me this horrible squirmy feeling in my head. It felt really invasive, intrusive. And that awful feeling in there, I had an opportunity to find out about that. A doctor came up to me in one of my talks and he said, if they're attempting telepathic control of you or communication, it's logical that they would combine that with the stare. He says, because the largest opening in the skull to the brain is the eye socket. And in the case of these beings with such huge eye sockets, it's logical that the stare comes with the communication or the messaging. I met some of the school kids from that incident in Zimbabwe. 60 children at recess, broad daylight. Craft came down, came out to these, 6, 8, 11, 12-year-old kids, and communicated to them through this stare. And so I asked them, what did that feel like? Did that give you that kind of feeling? They said, no, it was very pleasant, it was painless, and they had a friendly message. So that convinced me that what they were trying to do there was reassert control, and it wasn't working because of the injury. When that beam hit me, that it disrupted the neural pathways in a way that kept them from subduing me or keeping me sedated on that table. And for my own good. It was desperately important that the resuscitation, the reviving process continue. They had these instruments laid out there, and they had this instrument across my chest, and all that, I believe now, after much analysis, was an attempt to correct a serious injury that happened because I got too close to this thing, something totally unexpected by them. Alan and Steve, they think that the aliens made me do it, They said it looked like I was in a trance, but I think everybody had an astonished look on their face, To me, it felt like my own idea. They say, well, they can make you think it's your own idea, but I really did feel like just my own impulse. I think that it was unexpected. I got myself injured, and rather than leave me there as a galactic roadkill, they took me aboard and attempted to revive me. And so after I was returned, one of the medical tests was a brainwave scan and the EEG. And this was especially valuable because the technician did not know who I was or what had happened. He was just told to look for signs of injury, just do the scan. And so in his report, he described this unusual alternating pattern from front to back. I still have the report. That I think was an artifact of this injury from this beam and was the reason that they were unable to subdue me. And we got plans to do a follow-up EEG, see if that unusual pattern is still there, to get other neuroscientists to compare that to someone who's been electrocuted or been hit by lightning. And this was an extremely, highly qualified EEG. This was Barrow's Neurological Institute. This is the one that Muhammad Ali adopted when he moved to Phoenix, and he donated a lot of money to that hospital. And incidentally, he was very much into UFOs, and that was his original reason for coming to the area where I live. He set up his boxing ring and training in the airplane hangar while I had been doing my private pilot testing training. And he'd always had major sightings in connection with each of his fights. And it's no secret that he was very much believed that there was a connection between UFOs and his career. But anyway, Barrow's Neurological is a world-famous brain trauma center, and that brainwave scan is, among the best that could be obtained. So that's follow-up research, the ongoing research that's going on. And anyway, pursuant to that idea of the question about me thinking that their intention was benevolent rather than malevolent, is that horrible feeling that I was given again added to the feeling of this whole thing as being torturous, when it was actually for my own good. I was completely uncooperative. I was combative. And for these small creatures, probably a serious threat, even in a weakened condition. So it was necessary for these human beings to come in and save the day, sort of pick up the pieces and take over the revival. Some people suggest that the aliens were somehow able to, come up with some sort of an illusion of a human-looking being, just to, quiet my fears, concoct some sort of an android. I don't know. Any of those theories are possible, but it's probably more likely that there was another human-looking species near enough that they could come, and because I was reassured, I did look upon this as quote-unquote rescue from these quote-unquote monsters, and and he was going to take me, and they put me under. It wasn't just a normal gas mask kind of a thing, and I think at that point the repairs continued, because right up to the time I was put under by the human-looking group, I felt mortally wounded, seriously, like I was dying. And so, again, a whole lot of factors point to it being more of a rescue than a experiment or anything of that nature. The fact that I was returned to a place where I could get help. They didn't dump me off on some asteroid. They didn't dump me back in the woods wherever they took me. They put me back where I could get help. I don't think it was possible for them to drop me off in Snowflake, where I live, because that's a big, wide valley. Any place within a reasonable reach of help, they would have been easily visible by huge numbers of people. But Heber, is these intersecting canyons that are kind of like cliffs, rocky, edges to them. And they were able to drop down below the treetop level, below the edge of the cliff edge, and at that point be completely invisible to anyone in the surrounding area, except to be able to keep an eye on me as I made my way to that phone booth where I called for help. So all of those things, and also with the fact that my anxiety about after effects, negative medical consequences never materialized over time, it came to be quite the opposite. Something I didn't talk about for quite a number of years till I could document it was I went in got documentation from my employers that I never called in sick one time in 40 years. So that's proof that at least there were no negative consequences. I mean, there are healthy people in the world, and it's possible it's just a coincidence, and I do try to live healthy, but it's also possible that a side effect of the repairs was a bit of a tune-up that helped me be healthy.
Hi. What do you think happened to your friend at the end of the movie? The relationship between you two is a little strange because you encounter each other after everything that happened.
Well, Mike actually came out and spoke with me for a while, but every so often somebody would stand up and say, "Yeah, a bunch of real heroes run off and leave you like that," implying that it was cowardly to flee at that moment. But everybody in the truck was screaming at Mike, "Get this son of a bitch moving," they would go, go, go. And he had the responsibility for the lives of the rest of the crew. They just saw somebody they believed get killed. It made no sense for them to risk their lives to save somebody they believed was already dead. So, but Mike took great offense at being, relegated to, this negative role, when actually the truth is it was extremely heroic for him to insist on everybody coming back to see if they could rescue me that night. So we had a bit of a falling out. We've kind of reconciled it, but it's still tenser than he came out with me and did an interview here a couple months ago for Russian television, but I really do need to see him more often because his health isn't all that good. He's had a number of strokes. We lost 2 crew members. Alan Dallas had a heart attack, and then Dwayne Smith. So people say your friends, your coworkers, we were at the time a pretty loosely associated group. One of the guys had only been on the crew 3 days. So we weren't a bunch of buddies, and there were some kind of conflicts. I've been in fights with Alan, and then Mike got in a fight with Alan, and a big fist fight in the middle of the street in front of my house. So it wasn't all that buddy-buddy, but still, a shared experience. Online to YouTube, you can see an interview done by Paranormal Witness on Sci-Fi Channel. They did a 90-minute special just about this, and it was a very unusual interview technique that I was very suspicious of, to the point where I was angry at the interviewer by the time it was over. But when I come to see it later, because we weren't interviewed all at the same time. Every crewman was interviewed in a different place, different town, different time, and I didn't see their interviews, but every one of us broke down. the technique that he was using was trying to make me relive it, and I didn't want to go there. But he brought out, after 38 years, the incredible emotional impact that had on us. So I kind of lost track of Kenny a little bit. I have his phone number, and he hasn't been answering it. He went to his trailer, and it's been moved. So I'm going to see if I can track down some of his relatives and see what's up with that. He was the crewman sitting next to me. When I got out of the truck, I left the door open, and it turned out here recently he's developed skin cancer on the arm towards the craft. And that's consistent with the belief that there was high radiation levels there. The Geiger counter readings on the men's hard hats were 4 times background level. A couple of days later, during the search, I think it was like the next day. So the hard hats were in the truck. They weren't wearing them at the time, but just that proximity raised the radiation level in those hard hats, and then it became discovered 15 years later that this radiation had caused the trees nearest where the craft came down to grow at a phenomenal rate. A tree that was 85 years old at the time of the incident doubled in diameter in 15 years. So there are a picture of the growth rings in my book, and it was more recently discovered. We had an expedition back there, Ben Hansen supervising, to inspect these trees. And because there had been a forest fire to kill the trees, we didn't feel any remorse in cutting them and getting a complete cross-section. Then it was discovered that this thickened growth ring thing was directional, what Ben Hansen referred to as very significant findings, in a great understatement. The thickened rings were on the side towards the craft, whether it was east, west, north, or south, and in the circle around where the craft had been. So this radiation was having a direct effect on those growth rings. I know that we're accustomed to believing that radiation kills living things, but Ben Hansen went online and found these studies that were done on the pine trees around the Chernobyl nuclear accident, and discovered that those trees were growing at a phenomenally increased rate, 3 times the rate that they had before. Now, in the case of the nuclear leak, the radiation was coming from all sides, but it is now an established fact that, at least for pine trees, this radiation causes a rapid increase in growth for some reason. Next question. Yeah.
Did anything else happen on the ship? And how long do you think you were?
Yeah, I think a lot more happened. That came out under hypnosis. Probably a lot of that 5 days, I was either dead or in a coma, but there were little glimmers of memory that came through, plus the hypnotist actually did determine that there were memories that were blocked from recall. And so there's more there, but when I did the hypnosis, he didn't try to push through that barrier. There was a threat associated with a danger to me. And the main thing that was achieved there was a remarkable ability to separate the recall and the recounting of these events from the huge amount of fear that I'd had up to that point. This was only a few days after it happened, and I could hardly finish a sentence. I hadn't even told my brother, who had been, very protective of me in those days, because I was in extremely fragile condition. I hadn't even finished telling him the whole story, because I'd just break down. And he knew better than to press it, but the technique with the hypnosis was to separate the fear, and that was kind of a milestone too, because even though it was still very, very terrifying to talk about, it did help a lot from that point on.
Yes, my question is, I watched the movie many times, Fire in the Sky. When you were escaping, that was the most intense for me. Could you touch base that a little bit? The escape. When you escaped.
And what's the question again?
how was it for you to escape from that?
Well, of course it was extremely relief. I felt huge relief when I found myself on the road and I saw that craft going back up into the sky. I felt a huge amount of relief here. I mean, in the forest, in the dark, but it was still so much in contrast to the state of total terror that I'd felt during my last conscious moment. So it wasn't all that alarming to find myself in the dark, and I just, made a beeline. I recognized the lights of the town down there, and just ran down in there and started pounding on the
Inside of the ship, was it like honeycomb or?
Oh, no. I have to emphasize that, Hollywood changed everything aboard the craft.
That's what I thought.
And, everything became its opposite, large-eyed creatures became little tiny beady eyes. A very sterile environment. It became cluttered. It was very mechanical inside. They had it looking very organic. For some reason, during those years, that was what they wanted spaceships to look like, the inside of a living organism or something. It wasn't cluttered. It wasn't organic. It's a very mechanical, sterile environment. But that didn't make it any less frightening. I mean, I felt trapped.
So basically, they just lowered you on top of a safe area.
There were no cocoons, nothing of that nature. At the time, there was a mini-series on TV depicting that type of creature. And Brandon Tartikoff was head of Paramount at the time, and he said, well, if we don't show the audiences something different, we're going to pull the plug on this. So they changed it. I didn't learn of it until pretty late in the process. The first copy of the script I had didn't even have the abduction sequence in it. I got blamed for those changes, but believe me, I was complaining about much more minor fictionalizations in the rest of the script, and basically having my objections not taken seriously. So I was powerless to keep them on track there. But we do intend to allow a remake, strictly provided, that we're going to do it more accurately, more true to my current understanding of it. A number of people, a huge number, have sent me emails expressing the desire to see a more accurate remake, and so I've been collecting all those emails. I'll eventually bind them all together in one book and take them to the studio and say, okay, now's the time. I've been in discussion with a number of producers, and I had, you'd recognize him, a major movie maker, decided to move away upon hearing my insistence that we're going to tell the real story. But that's okay, it'll come in time, and I'm in no hurry. It's got to be right this time, and I think it's going to happen. So.
Do you feel any residual feelings from that abduction?
Well, from the moment that happened, my life, took a completely different turn. It took over my life. I'll never know how it would have been. I know definitely that it's not at all what it would have been had that not happened. And at this point, all I can do is, pick up the pieces, move forward, try to make the best of what's been handed me. You had a question?
What did J. Allen Hynek think of your case?
Dr. J. Allen Hynek met with me there in Phoenix, and he issued a press release the next day that I had been the subject of unfounded accusations, and that this was a genuine event. So he was very supportive in spite of the fact that he didn't have the case. There was a lot of competition between QFOS, his organization, MUFON, APRO, the various UFO investigative organizations, but he was definitely very supportive. Yeah.
Are there other benefits that you noticed after, like besides improved health, like better memory or telepathy or more experiences?
Yeah, but stuff I don't talk about. I told you, I really try to stick to what I can document, you know? I can document.
Hold your DVD there.
We're happy with your opinion.
Yes, I'll second that.
I was wondering, and you may not want to do it, if you would tell us your experience of what really happened in your own words from start to finish. So we don't have to rely on all the,
Well, you know, like I was telling you about that paranormal witness documentary, that's a pretty good one. This Travis documentary, those are the two top ones that have been done. And there's been dozens been done in the last 40 years. So I recommend those for a recounting. Both of them do some pretty passable reenactment too. That paranormal witness one even got the same make and model of truck, you know, a 65 International. I mean, Paramount changed the make and model of the truck to the Dodge. But, you know, they really tried to, you know, do a good job with it. I think they probably invested nearly as much money in that documentary as Paramount did in the movie. So.
did they take your words though? I mean, did they?
Oh yeah, the recreations that these two documentaries did are as accurate as you can expect. There's a few minor complaints, but I'm not the movie maker.
Do you not really like to go back and talk and tell the story?
You know, it's not the kind of thing I bring up on my own. It's not. People are going to enjoy talking about this, no, but I do feel a responsibility, and I do it when I have to, but never bring it up on my own. I never say, hey, you know, me, remember I'm that guy, you know.
Yeah.
I try to go sort of anonymous through life, and it generally works, at least it used to. Now I've had, you know, the TSA workers have recognized me, so.
I mean, have you ever told your story to a group of people, or has it just been to, like, you know, directors and writers and this and that? But have you ever just sat and told your story to your friends?
Oh yeah, I've talked to a lot of people about it, you know. Yeah, especially, you know, that I don't need to go through every detail. You know, they might have questions about things that they didn't see covered in whatever account they might have heard about it. So, way in the back there.
You saw evidence of other abductions on the ship. So,
Oh, no, that was a Hollywood fiction. I didn't see any other humans or artifacts of humans other than these human-looking beings in the blue uniform. But there were no other bodies or, you know, the whole cocoon thing was just not accurate.
You said something earlier that I've heard before, and that is that there's a theory that, and you seem to agree with it, that throughout, especially the last 30 years, they want to be seen a certain amount, and maybe it has to do, or it could be in concert with the government or governments to condition our society, our world society, as we move through time into the future, to finally accept economically, you know, religiously or whatever, the existence of alien life on Earth in whatever form and forms. So it makes me wonder, now that everybody's got a movie camera, everybody's got a digital deal with them, what are your thoughts on that? Have they pulled back? How are they engineering this?
Yeah, I think so. You know, Tracy Torme, a screenwriter on Fire in the Sky, made this point recently that he thinks that they've actually modified their behavior because of the existence of cell phones. Like I said, the NSA knows where they're all at, so certainly the aliens do, and they can control and allow this measured amount of, I mean, there's some interesting pictures coming up on cell phones, but they're always going to be shy of absolute proof. I mean, there's some pretty astounding footage that I've seen, but still, they can control the degree.
well, kind of a comment sort of related to that. I recently met Douglas Trumbull. He did the special effects on Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but as a special effects artist, he saw a lot of videos and felt that it was easy to make hoaxes, but he was curious about the subject of UFOs, so he teamed up with an astronomer to develop special equipment designed to track UFOs in real time, gather real-time data, get spectroscopy and, you know, velocity measurements, and set up these automated stations pretty much all over the place, doing mass UFO experiment, scientifically testing the phenomena. I guess my question would be, as an experiencer, do you think that the phenomena is too unpredictable for an experiment like that to be successful? Or do you think that if they blanketed the globe with these things, eventually that something like that might find a smoking gun?
Well, we can hope of that, but like I was saying, I think their technology is sufficiently sophisticated that they know just about what we've got in that regard. And, these kind of experiments might be something that's a little less developed and a little bit later than something the government's been doing all along. But still, I do believe that they have countermeasures, cloaking, whatever you want to call it. Our planes, the Russians' planes, our radar, their radar, there's a sort of a back and forth on technology just between nations here, and certainly the countermeasures that the aliens would have might be able to circumvent that to a certain degree. But again, the aliens might use that as an opportunity to allow an exact measured amount of stuff to come through, just shy of anything that's going to cause a problem, but just enough to achieve what they're after. And they are deliberately allowing a certain amount of discovery.
Hi Travis, this is the third time I've seen you. Thanks again for coming. I believe you because I worked at Los Alamos National Lab for 3 years. I didn't have as much security, top security as Stanton Friedman had, but I can assure you see those things, all the different sizes and shapes, day and night, going in and out there. So have you noticed that other people that have experienced what you experienced, or at least the abduction part, have some similarities in them, and maybe this one over here had a little bit of similarity, but not exactly like mine, and this guy over here?
Yeah, there are similarities of that. And, the researchers, I haven't done a whole lot of research of the field in general because I've had my hands full with my own case, but, naturally I get a lot by osmosis, people just coming and reporting to me, and there are certain things that people point out, saying that there are things in common. People with Native American ancestry, people with certain blood types, that sort of thing. And that's maybe in keeping with the idea that the aliens are engaged in some sort of research or program that is different from what I experienced, an ongoing sort of thing that I'm not aware of. People ask about the alien agenda in the singular, and I say, well, who's to say it's singular, There's a variety of species. It's entirely likely that they have a variety of agendas and more than one purpose here. But to whatever it is, it's still governed by this limited exposure program.
Did you ever, it just occurred to me, did you ever wonder why that night when you had this incident happen to you and the crew, did it ever occur to you to wonder why that ship was there? Why would it in the
Oh yeah, we've looked into the idea that everything that we could think of, seismic fissures that might be there, mineral deposits that might be there, underground caverns, mineral deposits, there was some surveys of the magnetic readings there. And in the following summer, one of the local reporters was doing volunteer work at the Deer Springs Lookout Tower, Fire Watch Tower. And a crew of government people came by, and they were doing magnetic survey on the ground, which is very unusual. Normally these things are mapped out using airplanes. They hang the device along the cable and just fly a crisscross pattern and map it out that way. But these guys were out there on the ground doing it. So it was some kind of government follow-up on that issue. And I was calling on the guy behind me too.
Sorry.
As far as what we would consider to qualify a legitimate case?
Yeah, I think people need to look at this, study this, understand this, but you still need to separate the wheat from the chaff, and I did a thing here in Canada the other day. We had these journalists from the Canadian media, and the idea was to try to get them to take the subject more seriously. And, you know, we all have to do our homework in order to separate the good from the bad, the wheat from the chaff, and to not just assume that it's all like what might be on the surface. You know, I compared it to the signal to noise ratio. There's a legitimate message here, there's legitimate understanding, group of facts, and we can get to that if we, you know, use discriminating reasoning to get to the bottom of it.
I have read your book, Fire in the Sky, but it's been some time since you was in the book. I remember reading that you studied Wing Chun or Taekwondo or something. So, I mean, were you prepared to use it like on them, or were you too paralyzed?
I was planning a heart attack to escape, but it turned out not to be necessary. They took off. But my son, my oldest boy, went on to martial arts, did a lot more with it than I did. He competed internationally, and he won every match except the one in Vegas where I couldn't attend. But you know, he was had some phenomenal abilities in that category. I'm going to wrap it up. One more question.
Yeah. You spoke about having EEG tests done on your brain. I was wondering, were there any other tests like MRI scans or anything that's been done for your physiognomy?
Well, I did have upper body X-rays, and it didn't reveal any implants. I did have a mark, the doctor said, on the inside of my right arm. He said it was partially healed, but not over any major blood vessel. But the drug hallucination theory, people just jumped on that and tried to say that I was injecting into my veins, but there was no vein there. So, and it was also easily something that might have happened in the workday prior to the incident. You know, we worked on a lot of thorny brush and whatnot. So there was nothing detected along those lines. Doesn't mean that it was that thorough, because basically we were just looking at anything that was, you know, life-threatening or health-threatening needed to be treated at that time.
Stephen Hawkins recently said, we don't want to advertise. I myself, don't put it out there that we're here. They know they're advanced probably. And the theory has also been the resources of this earth. What do you feel about that?
Well, I don't think they need to steal Earth resources. There's a lot of dead planets out there that don't have life on it that you can gather all you want. And I really don't think that they're that limited in resources. The universe is full of matter, and they can, you know, once they get control of energy and matter at such a fundamental level, I just don't agree with that kind of theory. That's the basis for human warfare, and that's what Stan Friedman calls our major preoccupation with tribal warfare. You know, well, I don't think they're like that. So one more question. Somebody I didn't get way in the back here. You know, okay, but.
So you mentioned that you think that they have a plan to slowly educate our society. When are we going to be ready, do you think, for them to announce?
Well, how soon we'll be ready, you know, has to do with, you know, one of the signs you would look for is people no longer ridiculing this, just intellectually accepting the idea that there's life out there, you know, not making fun of the whole idea. And a lot of this stuff is fear-based, and, you know, people don't come out and say they're just afraid of it, but that's really what's motivating them. You know, the people that say, oh, you didn't see aliens, you saw demons. You know, I really have no problem with that. We'll be ready when we're ready, and that's a gradual process. I'm just one part of a very vast effort to try to, you know, get people accustomed to the idea. And so, Well, I can't really answer that, you know. I guess we'll know when we see it. Well, thank you, sir, for listening, and thanks for coming.